Okay, so we're going to look at the Via Negativa today, or as it's sometimes known, the apophatic way. So the key idea with the apophatic way, or the Via Negativa, is that we can only say what God isn't. So the only language that is kind of useful or meaningful, truly meaningful, about God is the stuff that God isn't. Now that sounds truly confounding, doesn't it? What it means is that we can't say positive things. We can't say God is this thing. We can only say, well, he's not evil. We can't say he's good because our word good doesn't really account for it. Let me just quickly explain the difference between kind of these two kind of medieval and early church distinctions in religious language. The difference between the Via Negativa and the Via Positiva. So the Via Negativa, as we've already covered, is also called the apophatic way. And it says that we can only say negative things about God. Not, oh, isn't he awful, but rather, he is not this. It comes from the Greek word, and I'm going to write this in the English alphabet, apophemi. Apophemi. Which means, literally, it means to deny, which is why we have the word apophatic. On the other side, we have the Via Positiva. Now, the Via Positiva says that we can say positive things about God. The way in which we say that is a little bit tricky, and we'll cover that in another tutorial. But the Via Positiva, also called, by the way, the cataphatic way, says that there are positive ways of describing God, things that we can genuinely say that God has as characteristics. Now, this comes from the Greek word kataphasis. Kataphasis. Which means to affirm. So these terms, the Via Negativa and the Via Positiva, which are Latin words, come from these, maybe also referred to in these kind of Greek terms, the apophatic and the cataphatic. We happy with the terminology? Shall we get to some actual thoughts? Yes, I'm glad you agree. So, the first person we're going to look at is the Jewish scholar Moses Maimonides. And Moses Maimonides really describes for us the process by which the Via Negativa works. Essentially, it's this. If we describe, or by describing everything that God isn't, so by describing all that God isn't, we get an idea of what he is. We exclude all of the nots, and we're left with an idea, at least, of what he is. So this is confusing. And it's worth, I know in teacherly terms you should never say something is confusing, but this is weird, right? So I'm going to say it. It is confusing, but I'm going to explain it. In fact, I'm going to use Moses Maimonides' explanation. Here is what it is. He says, imagine that you have some sort of mystery object. By its very definition, you have no idea what it is. Although you can't define it, remember? This is the Via Negativa. So what we can do is we can talk about what it isn't. to get an idea of what it might be. It is, for instance, non-natural. By the way, as I describe this, I am using some of Moses Maimonides' kind of ways of describing this mystery object, and I'm adding in a few, and I'm condensing a few. So he does say it's, you know, non-natural, doesn't occur by accident, not a plant. I've just put down non-natural. It's also not flat, this thing. But before you go thinking, a ball, no, it's not a sphere either. Okay, so it's not flat, it's not a sphere, it's not natural. It's also something that doesn't travel by land. Any idea what it is yet? It doesn't sink, unless of course it's the Titanic. It is a ship. Did he get it? Maybe. Moses Maimonides thinks you definitely would. Now, I've cheated, because Moses Maimonides, or is it he who has cheated? He starts by saying, if I were to describe a ship in negative terms. So you already have the idea of a ship. But we'll cover problems later. Moses Maimonides thinks you can describe all of these things, the not things, and get to an idea of what God actually is, in the same way as you can get to the idea of what a ship is, just with not terms. As Maimonides says about God, in the same manner, so that is, whoa, that's interesting, in the same manner, that is, in the same way as we get to an idea of a ship, you will come nearer to the knowledge. Notice we're not getting a complete picture here, but just getting closer to an approximation, an estimation, and comprehension of God by the negative attributes. So just describing what God isn't, we get an idea of what he is. Now, this all seems a little bit odd, right? Why is Moses Maimonides describing the God in negative terms? Why not just say what he is? Let's look at why. Why do people support the Via Negativa? Well, the first person we might look at here is the theologian Pseudo Dionysius. So Pseudo Dionysius, I'm going to put this in my evaluation colour. Pseudo Dionysius is the one that makes our distinction between the apophatic and the cataphatic ways. He says that the cataphatic way, so that is the Via Positiva, he calls this, he says this is the kind of the way of speech. So it is describing God in positive terms. So the way of speech might be things like saying God is omnipotent or omniscient and so on. But he thinks, Pseudo Dionysius thinks, that the cataphatic way doesn't really describe God. So he said, but wait, God is too great to describe. So our terms, like omnipotent, are really only understood in terms of human power, right? When I say God is omnipotent, all-powerful, I'm thinking of like being able to lift a rock or whatever, because that's what I think of as strong, but it's more than that. And so really these terms like omnipotent and omniscient and so on can only provide, the cataphatic way can only provide provisional knowledge. So we might be able to sketch an idea, but we're not really understanding God. So it's only provisional knowledge. Whereas, for him, the apophatic way, so that is the Via Negativa, the apophatic way is something altogether different. It is the way of the unknowable, the thought, the inexpressible. It cannot be truly described. So the apophatic way is much closer, he thinks, to true knowledge of a God that is beyond our linguistic understanding, is unknowable. So he thinks it's unknowable, but he thinks it is truer, because our language restricts our understanding of God. So God is beyond language. So language, much like a map, might be able to point you in the right direction, but experiencing a new place is essentially beyond words. In the same way, understanding God is also beyond words. So we might be able to understand, say, God's immanence. So that is God's kind of presence on earth through the cataphatic way. We might be able to describe, for instance, if you're a Christian, you might be able to describe Jesus's actions. But God's transcendence, his otherness, who he really is, that can only be understood in negative terms, the apophatic way. Now, to get a slightly better understanding of what we're talking about here, it might be worth at the end returning to Moses Maimonides. So Maimonides is really influenced by several different people, or several different things. One thing that really influences him is Aristotle. We keep on hearing about Aristotle, don't we? Very influential guy. Aristotle gives us this idea, and gives Maimonides this idea of God as transcendent, beyond the limited world. Can I do it? Can I fit it in? I can! I fitted it in! Sorry. Anyway. But the idea of God as a one singular thing comes from Maimonides' Judaism, which of course heavily influences Christianity as well. So the Judaism gives Maimonides this concept of God as one singular being, one thing. Now, these two things together, this God beyond our understanding and this singular God, might give us the idea, he thinks, that we could then talk about God. But he thinks that direct, positive talk of God is what we call, or what he calls, anthropomorphism. So it is making God like humans. So anthropomorphism is making anything like it's a human, describing it like it's a human. And if we try to describe God like he's a human, then we are completely missing the mark about what God is, because he is this transcendent oneness. So the only thing we can do then is we can only say negative things. We can say nothing positive about God. We can only describe what God is not. And that is the Via Negativa.